Miles Davis was walking past a small Greenwich Village club at 2 a.m. when he heard guitar sounds unlike anything he'd ever experienced. The musician playing was an unknown 24-year-old named Jimi Hendrix, and what Miles did after hearing just 3 songs changed the course of music history forever. It was March 17, 1967, and Miles Davis had just finished a late recording session at Columbia Studios on 30th Street. At 40 years old, Miles was already a living legend who had revolutionized jazz multiple times, but he was restless. The music industry was changing around him, with rock and roll dominating the charts while jazz seemed to be losing its cultural relevance. Miles had been walking through Greenwich Village, thinking about these changes, when the sound stopped him dead in his tracks. Coming from a basement club called the Café Wa, he heard guitar playing that defied every category he knew. It wasn't jazz, it wasn't blues, it wasn't rock, it was something entirely new, something that seemed to pull electricity out of the air and transform it into pure emotion. The club was nearly empty. It was a Tuesday night, and most of the village's music scene was either home sleeping or playing to better crowds elsewhere. But down in that cramped basement, a young black musician with an afro and a left-handed guitar was creating sounds that would have been impossible to imagine just 5 years earlier. The musician was Jimi Hendrix, though hardly anyone knew his name yet. Jimi had been struggling in New York for over a year, playing backup for various R&B acts, and trying to get anyone in the music industry to take his original material seriously. He'd been rejected by every major record label, dismissed by club bookers who didn't understand his sound, and ignored by critics who couldn't figure out how to categorize what he was doing. To most of the music establishment, Jimi Hendrix was too black for rock music, and too rock for black music. His sound was too loud, too experimental, too weird for mainstream audiences. Even in the supposedly open-minded Greenwich Village scene, Jimi was considered an outsider. But that night at the Café Wa, with only about 15 people in the audience, Jimi was playing like his life depended on it. Miles stood at the entrance, still wearing his expensive suit from the recording session, and listened to what would later be described as one of the most important musical discoveries of the 20th century. The first song Jimi played was a version of Wild Thing that bore no resemblance to the pop hit everyone knew. Jimi had deconstructed the simple melody and rebuilt it as something that sounded like the future. Feedback became melody, distortion became rhythm, and his voice became an instrument that could match his guitar's intensity. Miles had spent his career listening for innovation, for musicians who could push beyond the boundaries of what was expected. In 30 years of professional music, he had rarely heard anything that genuinely surprised him. Jimi Hendrix was surprising him with every note. The second song was an original composition that Jimi would later record as Purple Haze, but hearing it that night in its raw early form, Miles recognized something that the music industry had completely missed. This wasn't just a talented guitarist playing loud, this was a complete musical visionary who was inventing a new language. Miles walked down the narrow stairs into the club and found a seat at the bar, close enough to study Jimi's technique, but far enough away to remain unnoticed. What he saw was as impressive as what he heard. Jimi played left-handed on a right-handed guitar that he'd flipped upside down, a setup that should have been limiting but somehow gave him access to sounds that conventional players couldn't achieve. His hands moved across the fretboard with a fluidity that reminded Miles of the best jazz pianists, while his use of feedback and electronic effects was more sophisticated than anything Miles had heard from rock musicians. But what impressed Miles most was Jimi's musical intelligence. Beneath all the volume and electronic manipulation, Jimi was playing with harmonic sophistication that rivaled the best jazz musicians Miles knew. The third song Jimi played that night sealed Miles's decision to get involved. It was The Wind Cries Mary, a ballad that showcased Jimi's ability to create beauty as well as chaos. As Jimi sang and played with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with his previous numbers, Miles realized he was watching someone who could master any musical emotion, who could be as subtle as he was explosive. When Jimi finished the song, Miles did something that surprised everyone in the club, including himself. He started applauding. This wasn't unusual behavior for most audience members, but Miles Davis was famous for rarely showing emotion during performances. Musicians who had played with Miles for years had never seen him applaud another musician's performance, but that night, he couldn't help himself. Jimi looked over at the well-dressed man applauding at the bar and recognized him immediately. Every musician in America knew Miles Davis, and Jimi had studied his recordings intensively during his years of musical education. After finishing his set, Jimi approached Miles with the mixture of excitement and nervousness that unknown musicians feel when they encounter their heroes. "Mr. Davis," Jimi said, his voice carrying a slight stutter that appeared whenever he was nervous, "I can't believe you're here. Your music has been a huge influence on me." Miles looked at Jimi for a long moment, studying him with the intense gaze that could make even experienced musicians uncomfortable. "What's your name?" Miles asked. "Jimi Hendrix." "Jimi," Miles said, "you're doing something up there that nobody else is doing. How long have you been playing like that?" What followed was a conversation that lasted until dawn. Miles and Jimi sat in that nearly empty club, talking about music, innovation, and the challenges of being a black musician trying to create something new in an industry that preferred familiar categories. Miles learned that Jimi had been influenced not just by blues and R&B, but by jazz musicians like Miles himself. Jimi had studied Miles's approach to improvisation and applied it to the electric guitar in ways that no one had attempted before. Jimi learned that Miles had been experimenting with electric instruments and was interested in incorporating rock elements into his jazz. The two musicians discovered they were both searching for ways to break down the barriers between genres. As the sun came up over Greenwich Village, Miles made a decision that would change both their careers. "Jimi," Miles said, "you need to be making records. You need to be heard by more people than the 15 folks who were here tonight." "I've tried," Jimi replied. "Nobody wants to sign me. They don't know what to do with my sound." Miles smiled, and Jimi would later say it was the first time he'd seen the legendary musician look genuinely amused. "That's because they don't understand what you're doing," Miles said. "But I do, and I'm going to help you." What Miles did next was unprecedented in the music industry. He began personally calling record executives, booking agents, and influential musicians, telling them that they needed to hear Jimi Hendrix immediately. Coming from Miles Davis, these calls carried enormous weight. When the man who had discovered John Coltrane, Bill Evans, and countless other jazz legends told industry people they needed to pay attention to someone, they listened. Within 2 weeks of that night at the Café Wa, Jimi had meetings scheduled with every major record label in New York. But Miles's support went beyond just making phone calls. He invited Jimi to jam sessions with some of the most respected musicians in jazz, exposing him to a level of musical sophistication that would influence his development for years to come. More importantly, Miles publicly endorsed Jimi at a time when most established musicians were dismissing rock music as commercial noise. In interviews, Miles began talking about Jimi as one of the most innovative musicians he'd ever encountered, regardless of genre. "People ask me what I think about rock music," Miles told Rolling Stone magazine in May 1967. "Most of it is garbage. But there's this cat named Jimi Hendrix, who's doing things with the electric guitar that are going to change music. He's playing with the kind of harmonic sophistication you hear in the best jazz, but he's also using electronic sounds in ways that are completely original." This endorsement from Miles Davis legitimized Jimi in ways that would have been impossible to achieve otherwise. Jazz critics who might have dismissed Jimi as just another rock guitarist were forced to take him seriously. Record executives who had been hesitant about his unconventional sound began to see commercial potential. The breakthrough came in June 1967, when Chas Chandler, the bass player from the Animals, heard about Jimi through Miles's network of contacts. Chandler was looking for a guitarist to manage and record, and Miles's endorsement convinced him to check out Jimi's performances. Within days of hearing Jimi play, Chandler had convinced him to move to London, where the British music scene was more open to experimental rock music. The rest, as they say, is history. But the relationship between Miles and Jimi didn't end with that initial discovery. The two musicians remained friends and mutual influences throughout Jimi's short career. Miles began incorporating elements of Jimi's electric guitar techniques into his own music, leading to the revolutionary albums Bitches Brew and Jack Johnson that transformed jazz in the early 1970s. Meanwhile, Jimi continued to study Miles's approach to improvisation and harmonic development, making his own music more sophisticated with each recording. They jammed together privately on several occasions, creating music that witnesses described as unlike anything either musician had recorded commercially. Unfortunately, these sessions were never recorded, existing only in the memories of the few people who were present. The friendship also provided both musicians with someone who understood the unique pressures they faced as black artists trying to innovate in genres that were often resistant to change. Miles had spent his career fighting jazz purists who wanted him to stay within traditional boundaries, while Jimi was battling rock audiences who sometimes saw him more as a spectacle than as a serious musician. Their conversations about these challenges influenced both musicians' approaches to their careers and their art. In 1969, when Jimi was struggling with the pressures of fame and the music industry's attempts to control his artistic direction, he often called Miles for advice. Miles, who had navigated similar challenges for decades, became a mentor who helped Jimi stay focused on his musical development rather than commercial pressures. "Miles taught me that you can't worry about what people expect from you," Jimi said in an interview shortly before his death. "You have to keep pushing forward, keep finding new sounds, keep growing as a musician. The moment you start repeating yourself, you're finished as an artist." This philosophy, inherited from Miles, drove Jimi to continue experimenting throughout his career, even when record companies and managers wanted him to stick with commercially successful formulas. The influence went both ways. Miles later credited Jimi with showing him how electronic effects and high volume could be used as legitimate musical tools rather than just commercial gimmicks. "Before I heard Jimi," Miles said in a 1970 interview, "I thought electric guitars were just loud and obnoxious. He showed me that electricity could be another instrument, that you could use feedback and distortion to create beauty, not just noise." This realization led directly to Miles's electric period, which produced some of the most influential albums in jazz history and helped create the fusion genre that dominated jazz in the 1970s. Tragically, the friendship was cut short when Jimi died in September 1970, just 3 years after Miles had discovered him in that Greenwich Village basement. Miles was devastated by the loss, though he rarely spoke about it publicly. Those close to him said that Jimi's death affected Miles more deeply than the loss of any other musician, including his longtime collaborators like John Coltrane. In one of his rare public statements about Jimi's death, Miles said, "He was just getting started. People think they heard everything Jimi could do, but he was still learning, still growing. He could have changed music 10 more times if he'd lived." The impact of Miles's discovery of Jimi Hendrix extended far beyond their personal friendship. By legitimizing Jimi within the jazz community and using his influence to get Jimi heard by the right people, Miles had helped launch one of the most important careers in rock history. More significantly, the mutual influence between these two musicians helped break down the barriers between jazz and rock that had kept both genres artificially separate. Their friendship demonstrated that musical innovation could come from anywhere, and that the best artists were those who remained open to influences from unexpected sources. Today, the story of how Miles Davis discovered Jimi Hendrix is considered one of the most important talent discoveries in music history. It's studied in music schools as an example of how established artists can use their influence to support innovation, and how cross-genre collaboration can lead to revolutionary developments in music. The basement club where it all began, the Café Wa, still exists in Greenwich Village, and there's now a plaque commemorating the night when Miles Davis first heard Jimi Hendrix. Musicians still perform there, hoping that lightning might strike twice. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of that night is the lesson it provides about the importance of keeping your ears open to new possibilities. Miles Davis was already a legend when he walked past that club, with nothing to gain and everything to lose by associating with an unknown rock guitarist. Instead, he chose to listen with fresh ears, to recognize genius even when it came in an unfamiliar package, and to use his influence to help that genius reach the world. In doing so, Miles Davis didn't just discover Jimi Hendrix, he helped create the conditions that allowed one of music's greatest innovators to flourish, changing the sound of popular music forever. If this incredible story of musical discovery and friendship moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this video with someone who needs to hear about the power of recognizing talent and supporting innovation. Have you ever discovered something amazing that others overlooked? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to check out more stories about the legends who shaped music history through their willingness to embrace the unexpected.